knows every shadow like a lover's name. Her steps a rhythm, a deadly game. Fingers chase the edge of time. She rewrites the world, one line at a time.
Chapter 7, Moscow Interlude. The flight to Moscow carried them above the clouds and into a different kind of weather, political currents that shifted with the unpredictability of autumn storms. The aircraft's navigation screen traced a pale arc across the map. Delhi to Amritsar, over the rugged folds of the Hindu Kush, across the Central Asian steppes, then into the vast Russian expanse, stretching toward the horizon like a promise and a warning simultaneously. Outside, the sky was an endless gradient of cold blue. Below, when the clouds parted, the world changed color in slow, deliberate bands. Indian browns and greens, giving way to the tawny, wind-combed plains of Central Asia, then to the muted patchwork of fields and forests that marked European Russia. On the monitor, borders were neat lines. From 11,000 meters up, they were invisible. The aircraft itself was a diplomatic transport, though it wore the skin of a high-end private charter. Its tail bore a civilian registration, its livery understated, a simple stripe, neutral colors, nothing that shouted state asset to casual observers. The paperwork filed with aviation authorities listed it as carrying a BRICS economic liaison team returning from consultations in Delhi. No one had bothered to question why the manifest included two mid-level analysts whose biographies were too polished to be interesting. One of those analysts was, officially, Elena Kovac, an economic risk advisor attached to a Russian development bank. The other, Priya Kulkarni, was nominally a South Indian-born trade specialist contracted to that same institution. In reality, the two women sitting across from each other in the small cabin were neither Kovac nor Kulkarni. Ananya settled deeper into the leather seat, the unfamiliar weight of her new passport secure in the inner pocket of her jacket. Her alias documentation had been assembled in Moscow months ago, long before Volkov had known she'd need it. The Russians believed in being prepared for contingencies most governments pretended not to anticipate. Opposite her, Irina Volkov sat with one leg crossed over the other, a hardened tablet balanced on her knee. The device was cased in matte black, devoid of branding, the screen shielded by a polarized filter that rendered it a blank rectangle from any angle but hers. Lines of code and bullet point briefs flowed past on it, updating as data trickled in from secure channels. They'd left Delhi 12 hours after the tea house confrontation. In that time, Malhotra had been extracted to the Russian embassy, moved under the umbrella of extraterritorial protection that still meant something in Chinakipuri. His debriefing, conducted by specialists who knew how to balance pressure with empathy, would be ongoing for days, but the clock was running elsewhere. 8 days until Operation Leverage's final phase was scheduled to unfold. 8 days to infiltrate an American intelligence facility on U.S. soil, reach the operational heart of an economic warfare program, and dismantle it before it detonated across global markets. 8 days to move from hunted fugitive to foreign infiltrator. For the moment, the quiet hum of the aircraft created a suspended interval, a space in which the past could be parsed and the future mapped. "Tell me about Hargrove," Ananya said, breaking the companionable silence. Volkov looked up from her tablet. The blue of her eyes seemed even paler under the cool cabin lighting. "Elena Hargrove," she said. "Mid-level CIA strategist, though mid-level undersells her influence. Officially. She's part of their Directorate of Digital Innovation, seconded from the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. Before that, she spent 5 years in the National Security Council's Economic Warfare Cell." She flicked her fingers across the tablet, pulling up a compressed dossier. A face appeared in miniature. A woman in her late 30s, sharp features, light brown hair cut in a practical bob, an expression that managed to be both engaged and distant. "Recruited into the intelligence community out of academia in 2023, Volkov continued. Her doctoral thesis was on asymmetric leverage in multipolar economic systems. The public version reads dryly. The classified version, circulated internally, reads like a tactical manual. Motivation? Ananya asked. Patriotism, filtered through exceptionalism, Volkov said. She is genuinely convinced that sustained American primacy is a moral necessity for global stability. In her worldview, anything that threatens that primacy, especially alternative economic alliances like BRICS, isn't a legitimate counterweight. It's an emerging disorder. Ananya had encountered that mindset before, during her graduate work at IIT Delhi. American exchange students who were well-meaning, often brilliant, but fundamentally unable to imagine a world where their country wasn't the natural axis around which everything revolved. They don't see themselves as aggressors, she said quietly. If you believe the status quo is inherently good, any resistance looks like an attack. Exactly, Volkov agreed. In Hargrove's framing, Operation Leverage is not an act of war. It's a vaccine, unpleasant in the short term, necessary for long-term health. She titled the original concept paper, Strategic Recalibration Through Asymmetric Economic Pressure. A euphemism for targeted strangulation, Ananya said. Volkov's lips twitched. You read it the same way we did. She won't negotiate, Ananya said after a moment. No, Volkov replied. People like her rarely do. They don't see actors like us as equals. We're variables in their equations. Obstacles to be optimized away, not adversaries to be reasoned with. The aircraft banked slightly, beginning its gradual descent. Through the small window, clouds thinned to reveal patches of landscape, squares of farmland, clusters of trees. The glint of a distant river. The light outside had the washed-out quality of a high-latitude afternoon in autumn. Ananya turned the conversation inward. Why bring me to Moscow first? She asked. We could have planned remotely. You could have pushed the intel to me in Delhi and moved assets independently. 2 reasons, Volkov said. First, we needed you in a jurisdiction where my people can protect you more effectively than yours can hunt you. Even with embassy cover in Delhi, we were operating under constraints. Here, those constraints are ours to set. And second, Volkov said, you needed to see what you're helping defend. Ananya raised an eyebrow. Russia's global posture? Not just Russia's, Volkov said. The entire architecture that leverage is designed to destabilize. The alternative lines of credit, energy, and infrastructure that give countries like yours options beyond Washington and Brussels. If you're going to risk your life infiltrating an American black facility, it helps to understand the full shape of the board. The landing gear extended with a muted thud. Outside, Sheremetyevo's runways came into view. Long, gray scars on the earth, lined with lights that winked against the dim sky. Aircraft of various sizes sat parked at gates, their tails bearing flags and logos from 6 nations. The jet touched down with a firm but controlled impact. Reverse thrust roared briefly, then eased. The plane taxied off the main runway toward a more secluded corner of the airfield. They disembarked not through a public jet bridge, but onto a quiet tarmac lane where a small convoy waited, 2 black sedans and a gray van with diplomatic plates, flanked by men and women in plain coats, whose posture screamed security even without visible weapons. Moscow's air felt different the moment Ananya stepped onto the tarmac. Colder, drier, with a faint industrial tang beneath the crispness. The sky was a low, oppressive sheet of cloud, the kind that threatened rain or snow without committing yet. Inside the terminal, their passage was choreographed with bureaucratic efficiency. Passports were examined, visas checked, identities verified, at least the identities listed on their documents. The officials handling the process were courteous but not warm, their professionalism honed by decades of dealing with people whose real names were state secrets. Within an hour, Ananya and Volkov were seated in a secure briefing room deep inside a complex that housed some of the SVR's most sensitive operations. The room was windowless, the walls lined with sound-dampening panels disguised as tasteful gray fabric. A large table dominated the center, surrounded by ergonomic chairs. On the far wall, a projection surface waited. The door opened. A man entered, flanked by 2 aides. Colonel Dmitry Volkov bore little physical resemblance to his niece beyond a certain sharpness of gaze. Where Irina was lean and angular, he was compact, broad-shouldered, his build hinting at a younger life spent in more kinetic roles. His hair was steel gray and cut short in a style that hadn't changed much since Soviet uniforms were standard issue. Lines around his mouth and eyes spoke of equal parts laughter and stress. He extended his hand first to Ananya. "Agent Rao," he said in English that carried only a faint trace of Russian cadence. "On behalf of the Russian Federation, thank you for not allowing your own government's short-sightedness to prevent you from using your talents." Ananya took his hand. His grip was firm, not crushing, the shake brief. "I'm not here for your government," she said. "I'm here to stop theirs." "Yes," he said simply. "Sometimes interests align even when flags do not." He nodded to his niece, Irina. "Dmitri," she replied, the informality of family sliding under the professional veneer. They sat. One of the aides dimmed the lights, then tapped a control panel. The projection surface lit up, displaying a stylized globe overlaid with a spiderweb of red and blue lines. "Your investigation has confirmed what we suspected for 18 months, Dmitri began, without preamble or ceremony. "The United States is engaged in systematic economic warfare against nations that pursue strategic independence outside its approved channels. Operation Leverage represents the most sophisticated implementation of that doctrine we've encountered." He gestured. The globe rotated, zooming in on clusters of data points. Each point pulsed, labeled with an alphanumeric tag: LGIND Port 07, LG Brazil Fin 03, LG RSA Farm 02. "These," he said, "are the nodes we've identified on our side. Your Frankfurt capture has expanded this significantly." The view shifted. The red points multiplied, spreading across Asia, Africa, South America. Some were highlighted in a darker shade, indicating active exploitation. Others glowed fainter, marked as preconditioned. "The Virginia facility," Dmitri continued, "is their operational heart. They call it, among themselves, the orchestrator. Disable it, and the entire leverage architecture collapses into a less coherent, less dangerous mess. It won't vanish, but it will lose central coordination. Without that, the cascading narrative they want to construct becomes far harder to sustain." "The facility is Next Wave Cloud Solutions," Irina added, "a private contractor on paper. In reality, a proprietary controlled entirely by the agency. Full-spectrum integration, physical security, digital infrastructure, human resources." "Security?" Ananya asked. The word encompassed much more in her mind than cameras and guards. "Layered," Dmitri said. "Outer perimeter, standard corporate campus protocols, badge access, vehicle checks, cameras, manned gates. Inner layers, biometric checkpoints, air gap segments, internal intrusion detection tuned specifically to recognize our known toolkits. They have prepared for Russian cyber intrusions thoroughly. They have prepared for Chinese industrial espionage moderately. They have not, so far as we can tell, prepared for an Indian field officer walking through their front door. Under a third country cover," Irina said, "one they underestimate." The projection zoomed further, showing an overhead satellite image of a campus. 3 main buildings, a smaller utility structure, a parking lot, a ring road. Trees lined the perimeter in neat rows. Security cameras were marked in blue. Guard post routes in yellow. "Your primary target," Irina said, tapping the 3rd floor of the central building, "is this cluster, the leverage coordination node. Hargrove holds court there. That floor houses the orchestration servers and the command interfaces they use to monitor and adjust live operations." Ananya studied the layout, noting stairwells, elevator shafts, emergency exits. Her mind built a 3-dimensional model, layering movement paths over structural constraints. "Entry strategy?" she asked. "A formal one," Dmitri said. "Your cover will be as a senior solutions architect from an allied cloud provider seeking to finalize a subcontracting partnership. NextWave operates on a mixed sourcing model. They routinely court external companies for specialized modules. We have an existing front company that has done minor work for them in the past. Enough to get you in the door. That won't get me to the 3rd floor alone," Ananya said. "Client tours don't go near primary command zones." "No," Irina said. "But Hargrove is not just a strategist. She's a control enthusiast. She likes to personally evaluate any external tech that might touch Leverage's ecosystem. Your fictional product will be a module that supposedly enhances anomaly detection in trade flows, a tool she can't resist assessing. She will want to see it. and she will want to see you demonstrate it where she can control the environment. That gives you a chance to sit in her nest. And once I'm there, Ananya said, I access the coordination node. Deploy your countermeasure suite and hope their internal alerts don't scream too loudly before I'm done. Dmitri smiled without humor. That is the essence, yes. Extraction plan? She asked. As of now, Dmitri said, improvised. The Americans will be watching for any unusual Russian diplomatic movements around that time. We cannot extract you under our flag without setting off alarms that may compromise the op. We can get you into the country with a clean, deeply seated identity and provide electronic support, but once you step inside that facility, you will be, functionally, alone. Ananya absorbed this with no visible reaction. Isolation was not new. In Pakistani-controlled Kashmir, she had once spent 3 days moving between safe points, with no guarantee anyone even knew which valley she was in. In Shenzhen, during a technology transfer probe, she'd navigated a maze of corporate espionage with only a prepaid phone and a single dead drop. Not entirely alone, Irina said, interjecting. I'll be embedded as your remote operator from a separate location inside the US, a rented workspace in Arlington, for example. Far enough from the facility to avoid immediate correlation, close enough for low-latency support. I'll handle electronic warfare, data capture, and counter-intrusion routines while you do the physical work. You've done this dance before? Ananya asked. Irina's mouth quirked. Not with you, she said, but with others. Think of it as an unpleasantly intimate form of tech support. Ananya nodded slowly. I'll need 3 things, she said, voice steady. First, full access to your quantum decryption and mirror payload tools, the ones you've been designing specifically to counter Western architectures. I understand you're protective of them. We don't share them lightly, Dmitri said. But in this case, we've decided that the greater risk lies in letting leverage run its course. Second, Ananya continued, a cover identity that can survive deep background, not just surface records and fabricated LinkedIn profiles. I need tax histories, educational transcripts, flight logs, enough to withstand automated correlation checks and human curiosity. We've been building such an identity for months, Irina said, initially for one of our own assets. We're repurposing it. Some of the details will be uncomfortable, but they're necessary. And third, Ananya said, real-time intelligence feeds once I'm inside the facility. Floor activity, external law enforcement chatter, any signs that someone has noticed the pattern doesn't fit. I can improvise locally, but I'll need your eyes on the broader picture. All achievable, Dmitri said. However, understand the stakes with absolute clarity, Agent Rao. If you are captured, we will deny all knowledge. Officially, you will be a rogue Indian operative attempting to steal American secrets. Unofficially, we will attempt to create enough narrative noise to prevent your execution, but we cannot promise rescue. If you're killed, Irina added quietly, there will be no body recovery, no public funeral. You will become one of those names whispered in your service's corridors as a cautionary example or an uncomfortable hero, depending on who holds power at the time. Understood, Ananya said. She meant it. Ra had trained her for precisely these kinds of contingencies, even if they'd never expected her to use that training on a mission coordinated with Moscow. Irina reached across the table and placed a hand on Ananya's shoulder. It was not a theatrical gesture. There was no excess emotion in it, but it carried a surprising weight. 2 years ago, the idea of an SVR officer and a raw agent sharing this kind of contact would have been the stuff of speculative fiction or counterintelligence nightmares. Now, it felt like the most rational response to the world they inhabited. You won't be completely alone, Irina said. My voice will be in your ear. My code will be on your side. And if we do this right, our adversary will be convinced until the last possible moment that all the ghosts in their systems are their own creation. Ananya met her eyes. I've worked with less, she said. Dmitri exhaled through his nose, something like a chuckle without humor. Spoken like someone who has had to make do with deli budgets, he said. He stood, signaling the transition from briefing to preparation. You have 48 hours in Moscow, he said. We will use that time to finalize your identity, rehearse your approach, and familiarize you with our tools. There is also someone else you should meet before you go." "Who?" Ananya asked. "A survivor," Dmitri said. "Someone who has seen firsthand what happens when Hargrove's ideas are tested on real economies." Moscow introduced itself to Ananya, not through the red square postcards or Kremlin silhouettes, but through the quieter geometry of its streets. They stayed in a secure SVR guest facility near the outskirts of the city, a modern, anonymous building that could have been an upscale apartment complex or a corporate residence. The windows were double-glazed, the insulation thorough. Inside, everything was functional, clean, and devoid of unnecessary character. From the window of her room, she could see a slice of the city. Rows of Soviet-era apartment blocks, newly built glass towers, billboards advertising telecom plans and luxury cars. The leaves on the trees in the courtyard below were turning, pale yellow, burnt orange, a few stubborn stretches of green clinging on. Russia, like India, was a place of contradictions layered over each other. Old empire, failed experiment, new power. Its people had learned to navigate those contradictions for generations. They were not easily shocked by the idea of invisible wars. The someone Dmitri wanted her to meet arrived the next morning at a side entrance, escorted by a single bodyguard. He introduced himself as Mikhail, offering no surname. His handshake was careful, his eyes watchful. He wore a dark blazer over a simple shirt, the kind of generic business attire that fit 1,000 roles. Lines around his eyes and mouth suggested he was in his late 40s. "Former deputy director of an Eastern European central bank," Irina said, by way of introduction. Later, economic advisor to a regional bloc that attempted to negotiate better trade terms outside US-European frameworks. 2 years ago, his country experienced a series of market corrections that looked very much like the early testbed for the doctrines Hargrove refined. Mikhail sat, accepted a cup of black coffee, and spoke in measured English. "It started slowly," he said. "Minor anomalies in bond markets, sudden, unexplained spikes in credit default swap pricing, reports from our ports about software glitches in shipping registries. We blamed incompetence, corruption, outdated IT. Then it escalated." He described how containers disappeared from digital records only to reappear misclassified, how pharmaceutical shipments were delayed by random inspections triggered by algorithms supposedly designed to minimize risk, how stories began appearing in Western media about his country's structural fragility and institutional decay. "We tried to respond," he said, implemented new oversight committees, hired Western consultants. That was part of the trap. Some of those consultants were vectors, consciously or not. They brought in tools, frameworks, and dependencies that made us even more vulnerable. In the end," he concluded, "our government capitulated on a major energy pipeline deal. We accepted conditions we would never have agreed to a year earlier. The pressure didn't stop, but it changed flavor. It became manageable, acceptable. We had been taught a lesson." Ananya listened without interrupting. She recognized the contours. What had been tested on Mikhail's country was now being refined for larger targets. "Hargrove's concept paper," he said, "was circulating in certain circles even back then, not by name, but by reference. Asymmetric recalibration, strategic nudging. They never called it what it was. Economic coercion weaponized with plausible deniability." He looked at her. "If you have a chance to cut out the heart of this thing," he said, "take it. It will not remain limited to nations your press calls like-minded partners of Russia. In time, it will be aimed at anyone who gets creative with autonomy, including your own country, no matter who you align with later." "I know," Ananya said. His account didn't add new technical details. It added something else: texture, human cost. Later, in the operations room, surrounded by SVR technicians and their machines, she felt the weight of that cost like a physical presence. They spent the remaining time in Moscow building Ananya's new shell. Her cover identity for the US would be Mira Patel, a cybersecurity architect for an Indian-founded, Singapore-incorporated cloud services firm that specialized in trade analytics. The identity had been seeded years earlier as part of a different operation: tax registrations in multiple jurisdictions, attendance records at 2 international conferences, a modest social media footprint with carefully curated content that was interesting enough to be plausible, but generic enough not to stick in anyone's memory. SVR technicians walked her through her life. The high school in Ahmedabad she'd allegedly attended, the private engineering college in Pune that had graduated her, the internships at Bangalore startups, the move to Singapore when she joined the cloud firm. They drilled her on colleagues' names, company jargon, internal slang. They loaded a phone with contact lists and messaging histories that matched that world. They even had a handful of pre-arranged former coworkers who could answer basic verification calls if someone from NextWave decided to dig. Alongside this, she trained with the Russian tools, quantum decryption modules that could, for short bursts, brute force their way through key spaces that would stump conventional systems for years. Mirror payloads, scripts designed to attach themselves to Leverage's own code, subtly altering its behavior to misdirect, delay, or expose. "You won't have time to be elegant inside the facility," Irina said. "These tools are not surgical in that environment. They are controlled explosives. You plant them where we've marked, trigger them at the right moment, and then you get out." "Assuming I still can," Ananya said. Irina didn't offer false reassurance. "Our goal is to tilt the odds," she said, "not to pretend they're ever perfect." On their last evening in Moscow, before boarding the flight that would take them toward the United States, Ananya stood for a moment outside the guest complex, looking up at the low, roiling clouds. Moscow's skyline glowed faintly in the distance. Domes and towers and cranes, forming an uneven silhouette. Somewhere beyond what she could see, families were eating dinner, couples were arguing, children were watching cartoons. Ordinary life, existing alongside the extraordinary machinery she had been brought into. Delhi had its own rhythms. Moscow's were different, but the underlying truth was the same. Most people would never know how close their financial stability, or instability, came to being determined by decisions made in rooms like the one she had just left. Irina joined her, hands in the pockets of her coat. "Cold?" the Russian asked. "Colder than Hyderabad," Ananya said. "Warmer than what we're flying into." Irina huffed a small breath that might have been amusement. "You could still step off this path," she said. "Disappear into some corner of the world our satellites don't watch too closely. Change your name for real this time. Let others fight this battle." "We both know that's not true," Ananya said. "There aren't any corners left that your satellites don't watch." "True," Irina conceded. They stood in silence for a moment more. "Once we're on American soil," Ananya said, "we'll have to assume every move is recorded somewhere, even if not in real time. They are good at hoarding data they can't yet process. One day, someone will go back and replay it. Then we should give them an interesting show," Irina said. Ananya glanced at her. "You're not worried about what happens if this traces back to Russia?" "I'm worried about what happens if it doesn't trace back to anyone," Irina replied. "If leverage continues to be a ghost story told by those of us who know better, while everyone else worships the invisible hand that chokes them." The next morning, they boarded yet another aircraft, this one outwardly indistinguishable from dozens of others leading Sheremetyevo for transatlantic routes. Inside, the seating plan had been adjusted to accommodate a different priority: equipment storage, secure communication modules, and the capacity to run live simulations during the flight. As the engines throttled up and the plane accelerated down the runway, Ananya felt the subtle shift in her own internal state. Delhi had been betrayal. Moscow had been preparation. What lay ahead in Northern Virginia would be confrontation. The Virginia facility did not exist on tourist maps. It barely existed in corporate registries. On spreadsheets in Washington, it appeared as a cost center under cloud infrastructure services. In reality, it was the brainstem of an operation designed to choreograph global markets like marionettes. The architect of that choreography, Elena Hargrove, likely sat at a desk surrounded by screens, believing she was safeguarding her country's future by destabilizing everyone else's. In 8 days, or fewer if things went wrong early, either Hargrove's orchestration node would be crippled, or Ananya would vanish into the same darkness that had swallowed so many unacknowledged operatives before her. She closed her eyes briefly as the plane lifted off, feeling the shift of gravity, the press of acceleration. In that suspended moment between ground and sky, she allowed herself a single, silent thought. Not prayer, not hope, just a statement of intent. If leverage was designed to prove that no one could escape invisible coercion, then its failure needed to demonstrate the opposite, that even in a world of omnipresent surveillance and weaponized dependency, a single, well-placed disruption could still break a carefully drawn script. When she opened her eyes again, the runway was gone. Clouds rose up to meet them. The aircraft turned west. The interlude was over. The real insertion was about to begin.
Her eyes burn cold, her touch ignites. She's the heartbeat in the dead of night.